They say a man's home is his castle. Mine wasn't so much a castle as a modest redoubt, a patch of earth I'd claimed and cultivated. A place where the shrill demands of the outside world were supposed to fade into the hum of the cicadas and the rustle of oak leaves. It was, or should have been, sovereign territory. The fact that it abutted a planned community, one of those pastel-hued hives of enforced conformity known as whispering pines, was a geographical misfortune, not an invitation. My property records were clear, my deed unencumbered by any covenant, my life intentionally free from the petty tyrannies of any homeowners association. I'd made sure of it. I checked deeds and easements the way a priest checks scripture, with a foundational belief in their sanctity. My fence line was my Maginot Line, clearly demarcated, legally unassailable, or so I thought. The first sign of encroachment was subtle, almost dismissible, a flicker of orange extension cord snaking from the direction of number 12 Whispering Pines, belonging to a woman whose name I'd later learn was Karen. Though harbinger of fiscal hostilities might have been more apt, the cord terminated at her gleaming white Tesla, parked with offensive precision just inside her manicured HOA-approved driveway. The other end, however, trespassed. It led, with an insolence I found initially more baffling than irritating, to the weatherproof outlet on the side of my workshop, an outlet I'd installed myself, wired to my own breaker panel, fed by power I paid for. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it. I watched this parasitic ritual for 3 days. Each morning, around 7 a.m., the cord would appear. Each evening, around 6 p.m., it would vanish, the Tesla presumably sated. It was a silent, daily theft, small in monetary terms, a few kilowatt hours here and there, but monumental in its presumption. This wasn't just about electricity. It was about dominion. She was, in effect, annexing a tiny, electrified portion of my land for her convenience. My wife Sarah noticed it on the 4th day. Is she charging her car from our electricity? Sarah's voice was laced with the kind of disbelief that precedes anger. She's the heart of our home, the keeper of its peace, and this felt like a violation of that peace. Our son, Leo, young enough to see the world in absolutes of fair and unfair, just stared, his brow furrowed. That's not right, Dad. No, son, it wasn't. My first impulse, the one guided by years of dealing with intractable systems and entitled individuals in my professional life, was not confrontation but containment. I am, by trade and temperament, a planner, a man who believes in schematics and controlled outcomes. The outlet in question was an exterior GFCI, standard stuff. The simplest solution would be a lockable cover, but that felt too passive, too accommodating. It addressed the symptom, not the disease. The disease was an assumption of privilege, a belief that my property was merely an unexploited resource for her benefit. I needed to understand the pathology of the perpetrator. The next morning, I was in my workshop before dawn, ostensibly organizing my tools, but actually observing. Karen emerged from number 12, a vision in Lululemon and self-importance. She moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never been seriously challenged. The orange cord unspooled from her hand like a declaration. She didn't glance towards my house, didn't hesitate. The plug slid into my outlet with a familiar click. Then, she returned to her car, produced a yoga mat, and began a series of sun salutations on her driveway, facing my workshop, a silent, spandex-clad assertion of her perceived right. The deadpan sarcasm began to curdle in my gut. It was performance art, a passive-aggressive ballet of entitlement. I let it continue for another week. Each kilowatt she stole was a data point. Each smug sunrise stretch was an entry in a ledger I was compiling in the cold, quiet vault of my mind. The cost of the electricity was negligible, a rounding error in my monthly bill. The cost to my sense of order, to the sanctity of my boundaries, was accruing compound interest. During that week, I reviewed my property survey, the county zoning maps, the publicly available, if ludicrously convoluted, bylaws of the Whispering Pines HOA. As suspected, my parcel was an island, explicitly excluded. There was no ambiguity, no loophole for a desperate HOA lawyer to exploit. I was, in their parlance, an outsider, a barbarian at their meticulously landscaped gates. and they, it seemed, had sent a scout to test my defenses. The second stage of my internal protocol began: moral inventory. Was I overreacting to a minor inconvenience? Perhaps. But small incursions, left unchecked, become beachheads. The principle was the thing: my property, my rules. Her convenience did not supersede my sovereignty. The alternative, direct confrontation, felt crude and likely unsatisfying. A woman who would brazenly steal utility services was unlikely to be swayed by a polite request. She would argue. She would rationalize. She would, almost certainly, become belligerent and attempt to gaslight. No, this required a more definitive statement: the fence. I'd been meaning to replace the aging chain link along that particular property line for years. It was functional but aesthetically displeasing, a relic of a previous owner. This situation provided the impetus. Not just any fence. I envisioned something substantial, a clear delineation, a physical manifestation of thus far and no farther. I chose a 6-foot solid cedar privacy fence. The kind that says, what happens on this side is emphatically none of your business. The kind that also, incidentally, makes accessing an exterior electrical outlet from the other side rather difficult without a very long, very obvious ladder and a complete lack of shame. The materials were ordered. The post holes were marked, precisely on my side of the surveyor's pins. My son, Leo, helped me with the string lines, his brow still furrowed, but now with a sense of purpose. "This will stop her, right, Dad?" "This will define the boundary, Leo," I said. "Clearly." The construction took a weekend. Each post sunk in concrete, each panel meticulously leveled and secured. It was hard work, satisfying work. The scent of fresh cedar filled the air, a clean, definitive aroma. As the last panel slid into place, creating an unbroken wall of wood between my yard and the manicured conformity of whispering pines, I felt a measure of grim satisfaction. The orange cord, I noted with a certain clinical detachment, was still plugged into my outlet, now comically trapped on my side of the impenetrable barrier. I unplugged it, coiled it neatly, and hung it over the top of the fence, letting it dangle a few feet into Karen's yard, a silent return to sender. The following morning I was drinking coffee on my porch, which offers a diagonal view towards number 12. Karen emerged, spotted the fence, and her entire demeanor shifted. The Lululemon serenity evaporated. Her face, even from a distance, registered a kind of bewildered outrage. She approached the fence, saw her cord hanging there, like a rejected offering, and then, predictably, her gaze fixed on the spot where my outlet used to be visible. She paced. She gesticulated, apparently to an invisible audience. She even, I believe, kicked the base of one of the fence posts, a gesture of such impotent fury it almost elicited a smile. Almost. The deadpan sarcasm was now fully engaged. My internal monologue dryly noted the stages of her grief. Denial. Surely he hasn't. Anger. How dare he? Bargaining. Perhaps if I glare hard enough, it will spontaneously combust. Depression and acceptance were, I suspected, not in her repertoire. For a few days, there was an uneasy peace. The Tesla remained uncharged by my generosity. The fence stood sentinel. I almost allowed myself to believe this was the end of it. A clear boundary established, a minor parasitic relationship terminated. I underestimated the tenacious malignancy of the truly entitled, especially when empowered by the flimsy authority of an HOA. The letter arrived via certified mail, a crisp cream-colored envelope bearing the ostentatious logo of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Inside, typed on heavy bond paper that reeked of officious self-importance, was a document that made my blood run cold, not with fear, but with a sudden, crystalline fury. It was a notice of violation and fine. The violation, it claimed, was the unapproved erection of a boundary structure not in compliance with community aesthetic standards and impediment of shared community resources. The fine, $70,000. $70,000 for building a fence on my own property. Property not even remotely under their jurisdiction. My mind, usually a methodical processor of logic and regulation, momentarily stalled at the sheer breathtaking arrogance of it. This wasn't just an overreach, it was an act of open warfare, a declaration that reality itself was subordinate to their whims. The shared community resource they referred to, I surmised with a chilling certainty, was my electrical outlet. They had codified her theft into a community asset. The document was signed by one Karen Miller, President, Whispering Pines, HOA. So, the Tesla thief was also the tin pot dictator. Of course she was. The dramatic lighting in my internal cinema shifted from the gray tones of procedural observation to the stark, interrogative glare of a spotlight on a blatant injustice. My family was my emotional anchor. Sarah read the letter, her face paling. "This is insane. They can't do this, can they?" Her voice was tight with anxiety. The peace of our home shattered by this paper bomb. Leo, bless his innocent heart, asked, "Are we going to lose our house, Dad?" That was the line. They had threatened my property, my finances, and now my family's sense of security. They had mistaken my patience for weakness, my preference for quiet resolution for an inability to act. They didn't know who I was. Not really. They saw a quiet man who lived next door. They didn't see the schematics of the entire county's electrical grid that were seared into my memory. They didn't know that for 25 years, I'd been the chief electrical engineer for the entire Coconino County, responsible for every watt that flowed from the hydroelectric dams to the last lonely ranch house. I was the man who kept the lights on, or, if necessary, the man who could turn them off. The initial shockwave of the fine notice passed, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer about a fence or a stolen kilowatt. This was about a fundamental assault on reason, on property rights, on the very concept of lawful coexistence. The HOA, in its delusional grandeur, had declared war. They just didn't realize they were bringing a strongly worded letter to a metaphorical gunfight with the guy who controlled the ammunition depot. My response would not be a legal rebuttal, though that would come. My first response would be tactical. The intensely personal had fused with the legally lethal. The narrative structure of my life was escalating, and I was now scripting the tactical retaliation phase. My workshop became a command center. Blueprints, not of houses, but of substations and distribution networks, were unfurled. My laptop hummed, accessing secure county databases, cross-referencing property lines with power feeds. Whispering Pines, I quickly confirmed, was fed by a single dedicated transformer bank designated Substation 7 Bravo, convenient. I began to draft a plan, each step precise, each action justifiable under the Byzantine umbrella of county regulations and public utility emergency protocols. This wasn't about malice, I told myself, though a certain grim satisfaction was an undeniable byproduct. This was about demonstrating consequence. This was about re-establishing reality for a group of people who had clearly become unmoored from it. The supporting cast began to play their unwitting roles. My sidekick, in this instance, was a younger engineer in my department, Marcus, a tech-savvy, slightly paranoid type who believed all HOAs were sleeper cells for a new world order of beige conformity. His paranoia, for once, was proving useful. "They're fining you 70 grand for a fence on your own land, Chief?" He'd sputtered when I'd selectively briefed him on the pretext for needing certain access protocols. "And they're not even your HOA? That's next-level crazy. That's weaponized, Karen." I needed logs, maintenance schedules for 7 Bravo fault histories. Marcus, thrilled to be part of something that smelled vaguely subversive, dug them up with the enthusiasm of a truffle pig unearthing gold. He even found a recent, minor, and unaddressed voltage flicker complaint from within Whispering Pines, a beautiful, legally defensible pretext. "See, Chief? System instability. Proactive maintenance is clearly indicated." His grin was conspiratorial. The dry, deadpan wit was infectious. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Stage 1. A formal, notarized letter to the Whispering Pines HOA, count to the county zoning board, the county assessor, and my attorney. This letter would politely, but with the icy precision of a surgeon's scalpel, eviscerate their claim. It would cite every relevant statute, every property marker, every clause in their own bylaws that proved their utter lack of jurisdiction. It would demand an immediate written rescission of the fine and a formal apology. It would give them 48 hours. This was the feint, the diplomatic overture required before escalating to less conventional methods. Stage 2. If the 48 hours passed without capitulation, and I had a strong suspicion they would, involved Substation 7 Bravo. It wasn't about cutting them off permanently. That would be excessive and problematic, even for me. No, this was about a critical system diagnostic and emergency maintenance procedure, a carefully orchestrated interruption, calibrated for maximum psychological impact and minimum actual danger. A brief, pointed reminder of who actually held the power. The law enforcement or legal ally in this scenario was, ironically, the county's own regulatory framework. I would be following every protocol, every safety checklist. Every action would be documented, justified, and, if necessary, defensible in any court, or, more likely, any panicked inquiry from the county manager. The power paragraphs in my internal monologue were spooling out, detailing the flow of current, the throw of switches, the cascade of effects. The 48 hours ticked by. The silence from Whispering Pines was louder than any shouted threat. It was the silence of arrogance, of an entity so convinced of its own righteousness it couldn't conceive of being challenged. On the morning of the third day, there was no apology, no rescission. Just the smug, silent expectation that I would crumble, pay the extortionate fine, and perhaps tear down my offending fence. They were wrong. That evening, as dusk began to settle, I drove my county vehicle, a plain Ford F-250, but one with certain access privileges, to a quiet service road bordering Substation 7 Bravo. Marcus was with me, ostensibly for training and observation. He was practically vibrating with anticipation, clutching a clipboard of diagnostic checklists I'd prepared. They looked impressively official. The substation was a familiar sight to me, a utilitarian collection of transformers, capacitors, and switchgear, humming with the latent energy that powered several hundred homes, including the entirety of Whispering Pines. It was a node in the vast, complex web I managed, a web they took for granted. I went through the lockout, tagout procedures with meticulous care. Safety first, even in righteous retribution. Each step was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The heavy insulated gloves, the grounding rods, the precise sequence of disengaging the main feeder breakers for the Whispering Pines loop. There was a satisfyingly solid thunk as the first massive switch was thrown, then another. Marcus was logging everything, his pen scratching furiously. Voltage drop confirmed on loop 3B, Chief. Commencing diagnostic isolation. His voice was professionally calm, betraying none of the glee I knew he felt. Inside the climate-controlled comfort of Whispering Pines, the lights would have flickered once, twice, then died. Televisions would have gone dark mid-sentence. Refrigerators would have fallen silent. The Teslas, including Karen's, would cease their silent sipping of electricity, though hers, at least, was no longer sipping mine. My internal monologue achieved a state of cold, calculated vengeance, a somber resilience. This was not an act of anger, not anymore. It was an act of rebalancing. A necessary correction to an equation that had become dangerously skewed. We sat in the truck for a few minutes. The only sounds, the chirping of crickets, and the distant bark of a confused dog from the now darkened enclave. The visual metaphor was potent. A community plunged into literal darkness as a consequence of its figurative blindness. Then my county radio crackled. Not an emergency dispatch, but the night supervisor at the central control room. Chief? Seeing a fault indicator on 7. Bravo, Whispering Pines loop. You guys in the area? Affirmative, dispatch, I said, my voice level professional. We're on site. Investigating a reported instability. Looks like we might need to isolate the loop for a comprehensive diagnostic. Could be a few hours. Standard procedure. Roger that, Chief. Keep us updated. He didn't question it. Why would he? I was the authority. The irony was a rich, dark vintage. The surprise reversal was complete. They thought they were the power. They were about to learn what real power felt like. Or rather, what its absence felt like. We remained on site for 3 hours. 3 hours of darkness for Whispering Pines. 3 hours for the residents to contemplate the fragility of their modern comforts. 3 hours for Karen Miller, president, to perhaps reflect on the wisdom of issuing extortionate, baseless fines to people who weren't even under her thumb. I imagined the scene, the frantic calls to the power company. Calls that would eventually route to my department, where operators were briefed to report emergency maintenance in progress. The fumbling for candles and flashlights. The dawning realization that their meticulously ordered world was vulnerable. The calls probably started flooding 911 as well, for all the good it would do them. The local police, my reluctant authority figures, would be patched through to the power utility and would be told, quite correctly, that the chief engineer was personally overseeing an emergency repair. What could they do? Arrest the power grid? My phone, my personal one, remained silent. No panicked calls from Karen. Interesting. Perhaps denial was her strongest suit. After 3 hours following my predetermined schedule, we began the equally meticulous process of restoring power. Switches were thrown in reverse sequence, grounding rods removed. The hum of the transformers swelled back to its normal pitch. Loop 3B re-energized, Chief, Marcus reported, a note of triumph in his voice. All readings nominal. Good work, Marcus, I said. Let's call it a night. The next morning, a different kind of letter arrived at my house. This one was hand-delivered, slipped sheepishly into my mailbox by a figure I didn't recognize, but who scurried away like a frightened rabbit. It was from the Whispering Pines HOA. The heavy bond paper was still there, but the tone was different. It was a full, unequivocal retraction of the fine. It offered a sincere apology for the administrative error and any distress caused. There was no mention of the fence, no mention of shared community resources, just a desperate, fawning capitulation. The signature was still Karen Miller's, but I imagined it written with a trembling hand. Later that day, Sarah was tending her roses when Karen approached our fence line. Not the new cedar fence, but a section further down, where the old chain link still stood. She looked diminished. The Lululemon armor was gone, replaced by something drab. Her face was pale. Her eyes darted nervously. Mr. Neighbor, she began, her voice barely a whisper. I had been in my workshop, the door open. I stepped out, wiping grease from my hands. I said nothing, just looked at her. The silence stretched. My gaze was, I imagine, legally lethal. We, the HOA, we wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding about the fine. Misunderstanding. A $70,000 misunderstanding. The deadpan sarcasm almost choked me. It was a mistake, a clerical error. I continued to look at her. The cold-blooded calm with explosive emotional undercurrents was my operating state. She swallowed, visibly. And about the charging. My car, I'm sorry. It was inconsiderate. The apology felt like it was being extracted under duress, which, in a way, it was. The duress of realizing she'd picked a fight with someone whose reach extended far beyond her petty kingdom. The power outage last night, she ventured, her voice even smaller. Was that? I met her gaze. Substation 7, Bravo reported some instability. Required immediate diagnostic attention. Public safety, you understand. My tone was flat, devoid of inflection. A statement of fact. Her eyes widened, almost imperceptibly. The connection, however terrifying, was made. She wasn't stupid, merely arrogant. The arrogance had been recalibrated. Right, she said quickly. Of course. Safety. She backed away from the fence. Well, sorry to bother you. She practically fled. The climactic confrontation wasn't a shouting match or a public shaming in the traditional sense. It was this. A quiet, utterly defeated woman, realizing the true scale of her misjudgment. The public reckoning was the terrified whispers I knew would now circulate through Whispering Pines. the dawning awareness that the quiet man next door held a different kind of authority, one that transcended their pastel-painted rules. My fence remained. A symbol of defiance, yes, but also of order restored. The porch light on my house, which had never gone out, seemed to burn a little brighter that evening. The psychological closure was the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in Karen's voice. The moral cost? Perhaps a hardening of my own resolve, a confirmation that sometimes the only way to deal with bullies is to demonstrate a power they cannot comprehend, let alone counter. The local corruption, in this case, was the petty corruption of ego and assumed authority, and it had been exposed and neutralized not by documents, but by the simple, undeniable fact of a darkened neighborhood. The silent majority of my other non-HOA neighbors, some of whom had witnessed Karen's previous charging routine with raised eyebrows, started waving more readily. A few even offered appreciative nods when they saw me. One, old Mr. Henderson from 2 houses down, a retired lineman himself, caught my eye one morning. He just winked and gave a slow, deliberate thumbs up. No words were needed. The narrative had reached its conclusion. Petty harassment met with moral violation, answered by tactical retaliation, resulting in a quiet, decisive public reckoning. The weaponized narration of my inner monologue subsided into a watchful peace. My castle was secure. The cicadas hummed. The oak leaves rustled. And the only Teslas being charged anywhere near my property line were doing so well within their own sovereign territory, using their own damn electricity, as it should be. You wouldn't believe what some people think they can get away with, until they can't.